Jeff Stearns, Connected Through Cars, and I hope you enjoy part two. Don Heditsian coming up right now. And Don did hear something that nobody wants to hear when they're going 150 miles an hour on a freeway. You'll have to watch to find out.
First car I bought with my own money, like my first purchase, was a Lotus Esprit Turbo.
Really?
Yes. You want to ask me what my second car was? When the Esprit was sort of selling at the same time as, say, a Ferrari Testarossa, which was a 12-cylinder car, the 4-cylinder Esprit was actually close to half a second quicker to 60 miles an hour, despite having 8 fewer cylinders. 930 Porsche, some of the Saab turbos, and certainly the Lotus Esprit Turbo. And the car begins to rotate. And if you know anything about mid-engine cars, they kind of spin on their own axis, right? Because the weight's in the middle. So this car does a 180-degree spin. For the sake of argument, let's say we were above 150.
Jeff Stearns, Connected Through Cars. If they're bigwigs, we'll have them on the show. And yes, we'll talk about cars and everything else. Here he is now, Jeff Stearns.
So you asked me what my first car was?
The first car you had, first car you bought?
Well, the first car I bought with my own money, like my first purchase, was a Lotus Esprit Turbo.
Really?
Yes.
You might be the only person ever to say that. First car that I bought, Lotus Esprit.
It was pre-owned, and I was in my late 20s when I bought my first car because, as I mentioned, right out of school, I was always with a dealership, and not so much today, but back then, salespeople in dealerships and managers all had demonstrators to drive.
Right, that's right.
So I never had to go out and buy a car because I was working 70 hours a week, and they're giving me a free car.
Right.
So the last thing I was going to do was go out and buy a car I had to pay for.
Okay.
And frankly, the cars they were giving me to drive were nicer than what I could afford.
Because
you're
working in a Mercedes, Audi, Porsche.
Yeah, I was generally driving a BMW 3 Series or 5 Series, and I drove a lot of Porsches, 944s, 911s. So I was always driving a car I couldn't afford anyway, so there was no point in buying a beater that I didn't have time to drive, frankly. You want to ask me what my second car was I bought?
We can go right there. I was going to ask you about that Lotus, but please, what's the second car?
Well, it's kind of related. It's also a Lotus Esprit Turbo.
Well, then you might be the only one.
I'm probably the only person whose first 2 cars were Lotus Esprit Turbos.
We'll have to call Guinness.
That's probably a narrow audience, I would think.
We'll have to call Guinness. I'm going to make a note here on the clickbait. You're never going to believe.
The first one was red. The second one was white.
Okay, so it's very interesting that you ended up working for that company, but let's not go there yet. Were they both Esprit Turbos?
They were.
So Lotus, and you could, I'm sure, speak to it better than I can, and I'm looking at the paraphernalia behind you on the wall. I'm pretty sure you could speak to anything better than I can related to these cars. But Lotus was about weight. Lotus was not about the giant horsepower or the giant motors in racing. And who was the founder of Lotus?
Colin Anthony Bruce Chapman. And if you look at the emblem on the front of a Lotus, it's CABC intertwined on a yellow and green background, which were the Lotus colors, in case you were interested in knowing.
I'm very interested in that. Very interested. So Colin Chapman, didn't he have a saying about he would just remove parts off of cars until the thing would fall apart and then put it back on?
Yeah, I mean, he's famous for saying add lightness.
Add lightness.
The concept from an engineering standpoint, and he was an engineer, was to innovate using lightweight materials, using high-tech ground effects, for example. He was the founder, or the first, I should say, innovator to do ground effect race cars in Formula One with the old Lotus 79, which was an amazing car and won the world championship with Mario Andretti. So the number of patents that Colin Chapman holds is literally, in the dozens. The innovations that he's come up with over the years are amazing. From suspensions, have you ever heard of a Chapman strut?
No, I've not heard of it.
Okay, well, that's named after Colin Chapman. And Colin was not only an engineer and an auto builder and a racer, but the Lotus company actually did engineering for many other car companies as a customer. So they were very respected as engineers, not only for the cars they built, but for the cars they helped other automakers, design and refine.
Including DeLorean.
Well, that's an interesting subject.
That's always an interesting subject. Did you know Lotus is who engineered that car?
Well, there was certainly a relationship between Colin Chapman and John DeLorean in the development of that car, as there were with other people as well, and designers in Italy that actually designed the shape of the car. Chapman and Lotus has some things to do with the chassis and the platform. It was really, I don't know. It was a car that came from many directions, many nations, many auto builders. It really was kind of a melting pot of technologies and things. The engine was a Peugeot, Renault, Volvo engine. Different components on the car came from different places. One of my regrets is that I never met John DeLorean, because I was always fascinated with him. Growing up as a kid, as well as when I was in the industry, I just always thought of him as just an incredible maverick for what he had accomplished at General Motors, with being the division chief for, I believe, Pontiac and maybe Chevrolet, and rising up the ranks at GM. And there was talk of him being the president of GM one day if he had stayed, with the company. But as you know, he left the company to start his own dream.
Just wasn't enough celebrity for him. But he was father of the GTO.
That's right. Yeah, he really created the muscle car. Yeah.
And this was watching the drag racing, I think, on Gratiot Avenue in Detroit.
Wow.
And saying, okay, we have to do something. So it's a Lotus Esprit Turbo was a 4-cylinder car.
Initially it was, yeah. The later cars were 8-cylinder. The original cars, when you were selling them, that would have been what year now? 98, 99, something like that?
Yeah, 2000-ish.
So by the time you got involved, Jeff, they were all V8 twin turbos.
The original, prior to the V8, the 4-cylinder turbo, the idea, even though it was such an amazing supercar, was the weight.
Exactly. Well, yeah, the weight was pretty low for a GT sports car. I'd say it was in the 2,900 pound range, fully dressed. And the 4-cylinder at its peak was putting out about 300-ish horsepower on boost. So, by today's standards, it was a quick car. That was a 4.7 second 0 to 60, something like that. Very respectable 20 years ago. Yes,
very respectable 20 years ago. And unless you're in race cars, very respectable for a 4-cylinder car.
Absolutely. In fact, when the Esprit was sort of selling at the same time as, say, a Ferrari Testarossa, which was a 12-cylinder car, the 4-cylinder Esprit was actually close to half a second quicker to 60 miles an hour, despite having 8 fewer cylinders, which was a pretty amazing thing.
8 fewer. But talk to me about turbos then, because we were talking on another podcast probably about this Maserati, but what were turbos like then? I mean, now a lot of cars, production cars, have turbos. We can use low displacement. It's smooth. You don't feel anything. You don't hear anything. What was the driving experience? I mean, when you're going 0 to 60 in 4 point whatever, it wasn't a linear acceleration curve when you took off.
Not hardly, no. The original turbos, like the 930 Porsche, some of the Saab turbos, and certainly the Lotus Esprit turbo, these were engines that were running quite a bit of boost. And when you would accelerate hard with them, they would really kick, and they came on like a light switch. So the car would have very low torque and be very docile, like a normal 4 or 6-cylinder engine, as you're pulling away, up to 30 miles an hour. And then all hell would break loose after that. And sometimes the tires would break loose as well. So they were a handful. The cars didn't handle as well back then, obviously. The tire technology was not as good as it is today. And now they've learned to harness the turbo power either through a single turbo or a bi-turbo situation, in a way that comes on in a much more civilized way to give you the boost and the torque, but to make the car more drivable and frankly more safe for most drivers. So no, technology's come a long way, but Lotus was on the forefront of turbo technology. My first Esprit did not have an intercooler. The second one I did. They actually called it a charge cooler because it was liquid charged rather than air to air. So I'm not trying to get technical on you, Jeff, but intercooling even takes the turbocharged engine to the next level of perforance.
Are you able to explain? Are you able to explain what an intercooler does? Or
I'm not a technical guy, so I don't want to pretend to be. But the intercooler allowed for a more dense charge by cooling the charge beforehand. So as you know, if you get cold air induction on a car, you have a bigger spark, a bigger bang, you make more horsepower. In simple terms, it's essentially that. Just so it's a bigger bang.
You're calling it the charge. I'm calling it the air. So when
so that was a Lotus thing. Lotus called it a charge cooler. That was very Lotus. While they were doing that, a lot of other automakers were doing just what they call intercoolers. But that was a Lotus sort of coined name for their system, and it was very effective. My first Esprit was, I think, 228 horse and very low torque. And the second one that I had was putting out 264 out of the same engine. And I think on peak, it would get to 280 under a full charge. For like 30 seconds, it would make extra power until the power would dissipate. So on a cold day, when you got a nice charge on that car on a crisp morning, that car was making a good 280 horsepower for a while. And 280 horsepower for even 10 or 15 seconds will get you up to speed pretty quick.
What came after the second Lotus?
After the Lotus, I actually bought my first Porsche, a 911, air-cooled 911.
All right. So for the gearheads listening, I mean, you're going to be the favorite guest. First he had a Lotus, then he had a Lotus, then he had a 911.
Right.
And by now, how old are you? Early 30s, mid 30s?
Actually, there was a little bit of a break in between where I didn't have a car, so I'm not sure exactly. I can't recall, but I was probably in my 40s when I bought the 911.
Okay.
And then the 911 was followed briefly by a Corvette Z06, but I only had it for like 4 months. I enjoyed it. I really had a lot of fun with it. I put about 3,000 miles on it over a summer, and then I sold it in the fall, and just moved on to something different. But it was a lot of fun. I also had a Mini Cooper for a little while, a Cooper S, which I drove for just 6 months. Again, it filled a niche. I needed a car to get around in for a few months between different jobs that I was coming and going to. So I had fun with that. All in all, I've had 5 911s, and I currently have one in the garage. That's my toy right now.
You love the 911s. Did you ever take any on a road trip?
I did. Well, I wouldn't call it a road trip. I'd call it the drive home from the store. So I actually bought one in Chicago, and I was living in New York at the time. So the road trip was bringing the car home from the dealership after I bought it. And I was by myself. I flew into Chicago. Dealer picked me up. I got on the road at like noon, and I got back to New York at 6 a.m. the next morning. And I drove the whole time. And you may say, you must have been driving very slowly to make a trip from Chicago to New York that long. But I ran into some interesting weather on the way. And let's just say that when I was going over the mountains in the Poconos, I needed windshield wipers on my side windows more than the windshield.
Oh, my goodness.
Because I had the car going down the mountain literally at an angle most of the way down the mountain, because the tires were just not the right. These were summer tires, high performance tires. I had a surprise freak winter storm that hit me halfway through the trip.
So your tail hanging out through the Poconos?
Oh yeah. I mean, I had to make a decision to either pull over and get snowed in, because the snow was coming down like an inch an hour at that point. I mean, I pulled into a rest stop and the snow was over the tire going up on the rim. And I knew that if I stayed there too long, I wouldn't be able to pull it back out. So my theory was just keep it on the road, keep the heater on, just keep it between the lines, and get home as quickly as I can. So when I was in the mountains, it got a little treacherous, and the car was really loose. And you know what? I bonded with the car to a degree that had the weather been dry and sunny, I wouldn't have enjoyed the ride home as much, because it was white knuckles for like 7 or 8 hours of the trip. And I remember calling my wife and telling her not to wait up, that I'd be in sometime in the middle of the night. And then I called her at like 6 a.m. and told her to have the garage door open because it had snowed in New York as well. And I had about 120-foot driveway from the street to the house, and it was uphill. So I knew that I have to get a running start and try to plow my way up the driveway. And I couldn't stop, because if I lost momentum, I'd be in a snowdrift. So I had to just keep this thing going until I could pull into the garage. And I did make it. But it was touch and go for a while.
It's a shame you didn't have the right tires, because really that rear engine with the right tires is a phenomenal car to have.
Yes. Yeah. No, I had the weight over the drive wheels, which is exactly what you want. But unfortunately, I had these tires that the rubber compound, frankly, isn't designed to work below about 40 degrees. And it hadn't been over about 25 degrees all night. So these things were like hockey pucks, and they're just sliding all over the place. And it was a used car. So it's not like it was brand new rubber. The tires were half worn out to start with, and they were the wrong tires to have for winter driving. So the whole thing was a disaster. But to this day, that however many hours it was, by the time I got home with the time difference, it was the most memorable drive of my life. And I've never connected with a car and gotten, bonded with a car to that degree of any car I've ever driven or owned since. I had a blast. In fact, I never enjoyed that car as much ever again after that day bringing it home. And I ended up selling it a couple years later because I got bored with it.
What year was the car?
It was a 1997 Carrera 4S.
Is this the last air-cooled? What's the last air-cooled?
It was close to the last air-cooled. 97, 98 was the end of the air-cooled.
Okay, and I don't even know if there was a 98. We'll have to look it up.
There was. Yeah, no, there was.
There was. Okay, I thought when the water...
Yeah, 98 was the last air-cooled. 99 was the first liquid-cooled 911, and it had a completely different body. Those were the 996s.
And that horrible speedometer gauge cluster.
And by the way, I didn't mention this. That car was all-wheel drive.
It should have made it up the driveway.
So you would have thought it would have gripped really well, but in that kind of weather with those tires, even all-wheel drive won't help you.
I had a 96 after a white and blue, after I had an 88 or 89 poster car, red whale tail, black interior.
Nice. Both great cars. So your first car was a G Series car, and your second car sounds like it was a 993.
Yes. And I drove the red 88 to North Carolina and back to visit a buddy. I think it was Raleigh, as a matter of fact.
Okay.
And I can still, right now, when I'm thinking about it, hear that engine sound, that air-cooled engine sound.
That's magical.
Yeah.
I was selling those cars brand new. That's when I was selling Porsches, was that era of the late 80s.
So that was the best experience. I don't want to say best experience you ever had in a car. It may have been, but certainly the best experience that you ever had in that car. What about, you ever had a bad or scary experience?
Had a few. One of them was in North Carolina in my Lotus, my first Lotus that I bought. And I was with my girlfriend, and we were going to a winery to do a wine tour and a wine tasting. And I thought, what a beautiful day, not a cloud in the sky, sunny, great temperature.
Is this upstate New York?
No, this was North Carolina.
In North Carolina, okay.
Yeah, in North Carolina. Not to say that North Carolina is known for great wineries, it's not. But there was just a local vineyard, 40 minutes away, that made muscadine wine or something. So we thought it'd be just a fun date to go on, right, with my girlfriend. So I'm driving the red 89 Esprit. My girlfriend's sitting next to me. We're driving down these back roads, country roads trying to find this winery because this is before GPS. This is before cell phones. This is like, you get a map and you're trying to figure out on a map where you are and where you're trying to be. So this is very, old school navigation system. So I'm driving down this road and we realize that we've gone too far. It's just, there's no way it's down any farther than this. So we turn around figuring we missed the turnoff somewhere. So now I'm a little frustrated that we've been driving around for 45 minutes, haven't found the place. So now I'm driving, a little quicker to get back to where we need to be. And there's a line of cars in front of me. And I decide that I'm going to pass them. It's single lane each side. I decide I'm going to pass them and just get clear of them because I can see a mile down the road, there's not a car coming. So I know I have an open lane there. So all is good. So I drop down a gear, I step on it, and I pull out on the left side of the road to pass a couple of cars very easily. What I didn't realize, Jeff, and this is, hindsight is 2020, right? I watch out for this now when I'm driving as I'm older and wiser. But those little lines on the middle of the road, how they go from solid to slotted or striped?
Yes.
Well, when they're dotted, it means you can pass. Did you
Correct.
know that? And when they're solid, it means you shouldn't pass. Right?
All right. So this is a lesson for the kids.
This is a lesson for the kids. So I ignored the fact that it was a double line because I thought my line of sight was far enough that there's no way anything can be a problem to make this quick, easy pass. What didn't occur to me was that the car in front of me was going to begin braking and then turning left in front of my path. So if you can imagine, I'm now dropping down a gear. I'm probably going from 40 to like 50, 60 to make a clean pass. The car in front of me is going like 35 miles an hour. I get alongside it, and then I realize that the car in front of them is now literally braking down to like maybe 15, 20 miles an hour and turning left across the road as I'm heading straight for them.
Going for a driveway or a side street or whatever.
And the road was crowned. It was a country road. It was sort of crowned. So it was much higher in the center for drainage. So I get on the brakes. This car did not have ABS. This is pre-ABS braking systems. This car is just, you and your skill level. That's all the car gave you. None of the driver aids that we have today that will save you. So I get on the brakes and the brakes begin to lock and the car starts to slide. And I get a couple of wheels on the soft shoulder and I'm going, again, 60 miles an hour here. And as I get two wheels on the shoulder, the car begins to go into a slide and the car begins to rotate. And if you know anything about mid-engine cars, they kind of spin on their own axis, right? Because the weight's in the middle. So this car does a 180-degree spin at 60 miles an hour. It comes back onto the road, but facing in the wrong direction. And I'm going backwards at speed. And I slow the car down and I park it. And I'm literally straddling the line on the middle of the road. The first car that turned, I missed the bumper by probably inches or maybe a foot. The second car, the car that I first passed, is now headed straight at me because it's still going in the direction it was going originally. But I'm now opposing it, blocking the road, parked. I go to fire the car and it won't restart because it's hot and I just spun it. So I'm sitting there and my girlfriend is sitting next to me, mortified. She's turning, 3 different shades of white. And I finally fired the car up. I'm now face to face with the driver of the first guy I parked because he stopped literally at my front bumper and I'm making eye contact with him and waving. And I got the car fired up. I get it off the road. I turn it the correct direction and we drove off to the winery. Needless to say, we got to the winery and we both needed a drink. That girlfriend ended up marrying me, but she never drove with me again after that.
Yeah, I'm going to need to talk to your wife.
I don't think that's a good idea.
We need a separate one for your wife here. Oh my God. What about this high speed brake issue?
Oh, and by the way, just to finish that story, we go to the winery. We end up spending a few hours there. We drive home back to my place in Raleigh. I put my car back in the garage. And not only is there not a mark on it, but it's not even dirty. There's not even like a fleck of dirt or a stone chip on it. I was so lucky. I was so blessed, Jeff, to be able to get into that kind of a violent spin and not damage the car in any way. The tires weren't flat spotted. There wasn't even any dust on it. It was just God looking out for me that day. It was unbelievable.
It's also unbelievable. I mean, to get an Esprit out of whack isn't easy.
No, it's a very benign handling car. It's a very good car. You're right. I mean, what happened with me was very extreme, and I put the car into a situation where I couldn't recover it. That was my doing. So,
right.
But you're right. It's not a car you typically hear about. There are some cars they call widow makers. Typically, the Esprit is not a widow maker. It's a pretty friendly car.
The 944, 150 miles an hour. Was your wife in it with you also?
You remember that story I told you? Okay. No, that was a different situation. That was I was actually working. I was on the job. We had bought a 1989 Turbo S 944, which was the really one of the best and fastest versions of the 944 lineup. I want to say it was putting out about 250 horsepower, which at the time was considered a lot, really a lot. A regular 944 was putting out like 150, 160 horsepower. So this was a very fast car. My Porsche Master Tech was working on the car and needed to road test it. So he pulled around to my office and asked me if I wanted to go for a ride. So I said, sure. We jumped in the car. We're up on Route 95 and he's showing me what the car can do. And anyway, we pull off the ramp. We get back on the ramp to go back home. And as we're heading back towards the dealership, he just gives it the full beans. And I mean, we came off the ramp at probably 80 to 100 miles an hour. And I don't even know what speed he got up to, but it was in top gear at Redline. So I think the car maxes out at 158. So for the sake of argument, let's say we were above 150 at this point. I'm in the passenger seat. He's driving. And I hear him yell out something that was, not a nice word. And I could see that he was a little bit stressed. And I looked over at him and he said, "No brakes." "What do you mean?" And he said, the pedal's gone. Now, here's a guy who has been driving high performance cars his entire life. He had his NASCAR license and he used to be the head mechanic on a funny car team back in the 1960s. So this guy's been around horsepower since he was about 14. And he's a really good driver. We lost him a few years ago, sadly. Just a fantastic guy. His name was Al. And after he realized the pedal had gone down, being a car guy, being a mechanic, understanding what's happening, he realized that he had just overheated the brakes trying to get on them at that speed. He got off the brakes. He let some cool air run over them. We're still traveling at 140, 150 miles an hour. And he waited until we got right up on a cluster of traffic. And at the last second, he did a blip and a big downshift and then just got on the brakes again, giving them some time to cool. And the brakes were working again. And a little bit of faith there that the brakes would come back, but he knew they would. He just wasn't sure how strong they'd feel when we got back on them. Anyway, we slowed down. By this time, we're slowed down to about 80 miles an hour. We're now gaining on a cluster of traffic, and the sensation of speed coming from what he was doing to where we were, it was the strangest thing I'd ever felt. By the time we got down to about 60, it felt like I could open the car door and just step out. It felt like we were parked already. It was just an amazing experience, not one that I'd ever like to repeat. No, really nothing that exciting at that dealership. That was probably the scariest ride of my life because it was an unpredictable problem that we had to deal with. And there was always the risk that we're going to hit something or an airbag's going to open, but it wasn't the most exciting drive.
So, okay, there's the setup.
So here's the setup.
Tell us, please.
I got to ride shotgun with Derek Bell in the Bentley race car that raced at Le Mans
Oh my gosh.
back in the early 2000s. So Bentley won the Le Mans 24 in 2003 in essentially the same car. It was a different car. They had several cars on the team. The one that I was riding in was a different vehicle than the one that crossed the finish line first, but it was virtually the same car. And Derek Bell was demonstrating laps down in Palm Beach. And I was fortunate to be in the right place on the right day and was invited. They fitted a second seat to the car, which it doesn't normally have in it. And I got to go around the track with him for 3 laps at tremendous speed. And I'd have to say that was the most thrilling ride I've ever had, period, in a vehicle. It was amazing. And I know he's been one of your guests.
The passenger thing I can never be okay with. So when you're telling me the story in the 944, you're telling me the story going to $185 with Derek. I know you trusted Al, like funny car, NASCAR license. And of course, how can you not trust Derek Bell? But like to me, when I'm doing, and I never did like rosary, but I'd be doing like in my mind, like, Lord, I have kids. I mean, if we could just get through this, like I'm not enjoying any of it.
Right.
Now, I know you weren't enjoying the freeway thing because that wasn't meant to be enjoyable, but that being a passenger thing, to me, makes it 10 times worse. And I've been
the first situation I was in, I didn't expect that to happen. Right. I didn't expect him to go that fast, and I certainly didn't expect the brakes to go out. So that thing happened before I could even sort of deal with it mentally. You know what I mean? It was just in the moment. The thing with Derek, I knew I was getting into that car and that we were going to go fast. So I had plenty of time to kind of anticipate and get excited about that. And I really enjoyed it. It was scary. I'm not going to kid you. I mean, you're not in control, and you're in a car going, fast enough to potentially kill you or hurt you if something went wrong. But you're doing it in a safe environment at a track with safety workers. I was wearing a helmet. I was wearing a flame-proof suit. I'm riding with a guy that's won Le Mans 5 times. So if that's not a great qualification, I don't know what is. So it took a lot of the risk out of it, really.
And he talks about it while he's doing it too. He's so cool about it.
Very much so. Yes. Oh,
he describes
so
what's
natural.
going on.
Oh yeah.
I'd be like shitting a little.
No, I can remember we went around the track and one lap we missed the apex. And I've done enough driving on track to know the line and how to drive the car and where we should have been. And I could see that we missed it. And I looked over at him instinctively, and he looked over at me, and he and this is while he's managing the car at close to 100 miles an hour in a corner. He looked over at me and said, "How much do you weigh?"
This has been Jeff Stearns, Connected Through Cars.